Okay.
Or even if you have, if you've done any transfers or whatever. By
Hey, we're good.
all right.
Hey, are we ready to go? Just checking in. Okay. Hi, this is Brian from Deaf Hope. Hi. So I do see we have covered the first slide, so let's go to the next slide first. So hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is, let's go back, yeah. My name is Brian Berlinski. I use he, him pronouns. I'm Empowerment Director for Deaf Hope. I'll turn over to Araceli as well. Hello, good morning. Happy Friday, everyone. My name is Aracelia Aguilar, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm one of the other empowerment directors here at Deaf Hope. I want to maybe explain a visual description of myself. I have tan background on my wall, no pictures or anything. I am wearing a dark, solid black long sleeve shirt. My hair is in a ponytail and it's curly, and I am a Spanish woman. So thank you for allowing us to be here. I'll turn it back over to Brian. All right, hi, Brian speaking. So thank you, Arcelia. I will provide my visual description as well, and part of our commitment to access for those who, are in a space where they are low vision or have visual impairments. So I'm a white deaf man with brown, kind of grayish hair. It's short, and I am wearing a purple shirt, polo shirt, short sleeve. Behind me, I do have a white wall and then a dark blue curtain with the window behind me. So next slide, please. So before we continue with our presentation, well, I think it is important to acknowledge that we are on we are in San Francisco, and we live in a land that is a shared land with many people of different tribes and backgrounds. I'm going to type it in the chat here. So those are the Miwok, Mawakema, and Ramayatush. I'm not sure the interpreters pronounced those right, but if you're curious about those tribes, you can look it up for the indigenous peoples tribes. So I'm going to put that in the chat as well. That is the website that you can look in your area to see and identify those that are in the ancestral homes that we live in now. I do want to acknowledge the labor of people who are marginalized, who have donated their labor, often unpaid or low pay, that we would not be here without them, for their Indian heritage and the work of Native Americans and migrants workers as well, and the laborers who were not paid and whatnot. So let's go to the next slide, please. So today we will cover these items, these topics. First, we will start with an overview of the deaf identities. Deaf meaning one identity? No, we actually have many identities, and we also will talk about deaf culture and norms. We will discuss deaf survivors and their experiences. Again, that's a varied experience with each individual. We will talk about the language justice, disability justice framework and how we use that in our services. We will touch briefly on the concept of language equality and disability, or language justice and disability justice. We will discuss best practices for serving survivors. It's very important we mention those survivors. We do have a free resources to share, and then we'll close it up with a Q&A session. If there's any time during my presentation that you need to interrupt for clarification, please feel free to use the Zoom chat. And if you prefer to speak, you're welcome to turn your camera on, unmute yourself, and you can ask questions or clarification at any time. If there is more of a, content or discussion question that you wouldn't mind holding to the end, I would ask you please to do that as well. All right, I think we're ready. Let's go to the next slide. So today we have goals. Our goals for today are to prioritize your access and self-care. If you need to go to get the bathroom, go get a drink, whatever, make sure you are centering yourself in safe self-care. If there are any questions, you're welcome to ask at any time. If you want to ask, if you could hold some of them at the end of the presentation today. The goals for today, I would acknowledge dynamics among our different community members. We're not all having the same experience. It's not a homogeneous experience. Identify what autism means and the systematic barriers for survivors. And then lastly, we will learn tools for effective communication as well. Next slide, please. So before we continue talking about the deaf, domestic violence and survivors of sexual violence, I think it's important to give more of a broad sense of deaf people and their experience, and that will probably help kind of paint a picture of what we will present today. It's important to understand here that 90% of deaf people are born to hearing parents. I'm one of those percentages. I'm speaking personally. I was born hearing. I got meningitis as a 2-year-old, 2.5-year-old. My hearing I happened to lose my hearing at that time. Unfortunately, my parents fortunately recognized the importance of me to learn speech and learn sign language as well. And so I grew up learning both. And, back to the statistics, it means that of those deaf people who are from deaf families is only 10%. Meaning they're born, that's their first language, they learn to sign, they speak in the home, and they're called heritage signers. For those of you who are maybe not familiar with the term CODA, C-O-D-A, that means a child of deaf adults or deaf parents, deaf mother, deaf father, or both parents, even though it doesn't matter if it's, same-sex marriage or not, but their first language would be signing, even though the child themselves are hearing, they learn sign as a baby. So the deaf culture tends to, try and meet the objectives of where deaf learn, and one of them is in the deaf school. And deaf culture is most often passed peer-to-peer rather than parent to child, as it says here. Next slide, please. All right, so we're going to touch on some diversity of deaf identities within the community and culture norms. I don't expect you to memorize all of this by any means. I'm just kind of giving you a sense of the variety of different identities that we use when we use the word deaf. It can mean different things. It can mean, a person who identifies as part of the culture and the community. Sometimes people use the word lowercase d, deaf, and that tends to be, typically more of they don't recognize themselves as culturally deaf, just, see themselves as part of the hearing community and themselves having maybe a hearing difficulty or hearing impairment. So it's more of a medical view and just the inability to hear. That is different than being part of the culture and the community and being deaf, not focusing on just the ear and the hearing ability, but reflects of the sharing of cultures and experiences and language and the visual language that we all use as people that use the capital D deaf. Next, we have on here deaf-blind. You may be recognize those words are together. It is typically used together because it's, both. Their experience as navigating the world is set up for people who are hearing and are sighted in the real the world we live in, but those that are deafblind experience oppression in the deaf world and in the blind world. Next, we have I think I was gonna pause for an interpreter switch, but let's see. Okay, so then now deaf disabled is the next one on the list. And that is, could be a physical disability, an intellectual disability, anything related to the majority or the multitude of disabilities. It could be a disability from trauma or a TBI, that kind of thing. That would be considered deaf disabled, which is this used, together in one word. One second.
Yeah, we had the interpreter switch, so might be a different voice, but it's still me, Brian, speaking. So with a late deafened person, they maybe were born hearing and they were hearing their entire life until adulthood when they became deaf later in life. Typically, that's due to illness or injury, and we call that late deafened. Some of them may have found their deaf community later, learned sign language, been involved in the community. Others are not involved in the deaf community. They still rely on being in the hearing world. Maybe they rely on a hearing aid or cochlear implant if that's possible for them. The next term we have is hard of hearing. Many people tend to call themselves hard of hearing. Maybe they've got some hearing loss, but it's not as significant. And then you'll see hearing impaired. Typically, hearing impaired is more of a medical perspective and way to identify as opposed to maybe they see themselves as maybe not normal or need fixed, that they have a hearing impairment. Just to let you know, a lot of people from the deaf community feel very that term is very offensive to call them hearing impaired. They see that they see themselves as a individual, and if somebody wants to see themselves as hearing impaired, then respect that identity. Next, we see dominant ASL or dominant English. Um, referring to that, it depends on the person if they have a strong preference, the way that their brain thinks, the language, their primary language. If they mainly use ASL, then they may think in ASL. They may have second or third languages that they have, as opposed to dominantly English. Their language is primarily English, and they think of themselves as dominantly English. And then biculturally, then they switch between ASL and English pretty fluidly. Myself, I was born hearing into a hearing family. I went to a hearing school, and my first language is English. But myself, I learned ASL later in life. I grew up signing, but I wouldn't call that ASL. It was a modified form of sign language based on English. I didn't learn ASL until college when I was 18. That was the first time I was really exposed to ASL at 18 because I went to a school that had a very strong deaf community there. There was a lot of people there, a lot of students that used ASL, and I was able to learn sign language there at that time. So I consider myself a little more English leaning rather than ASL. Some of our cultural norms, uh, you might be wondering of those. Eye contact is very important. We really cherish that because it's a visual way of communication, body language, facial expressions, sign language. We have a generalized for the general public. There's, we have more relaxed time. We're more fluid on our time frames. Um, so we'll see you at 5 might mean, might be 6 o'clock by the time we get there. A little more fluid on that time. We call that deaf standard time, excuse me, deaf standard time. So another important value is transparency. We really want to share that information. We share information with everybody. Remember, growing up, we didn't have the same access as hearing people that can get information just by listening into other conversations. So information we get is a lot more difficult. There's a lot of blank spaces, a lot of missing information. So we really appreciate when people are transparent. We want that transparency. And so if you're not aware, we do want that more explicit. We really do cherish that. And then the last point that I want to share is the difference between deaf and disability. Many do, yeah, go back again to that bulleted slide. Um, a lot of people are fine with that. A lot of people might be offended by that and say, "Oh, I'm not disabled." But to the general population, people that don't have deaf family or went to a deaf school, they don't necessarily feel that that term applies the same way. I use sign language. There's no barrier to my communication because I'm around people that sign. A lot of people don't feel that that label of disability applies. Other deaf people do feel, yeah, I am a person with a disability, and they accept that and identify that way. It's, again, a variation. It depends on the disability. Some people accept that, some people do not want that label applied. Next slide, please. And now we're going to dive into specific information with deaf domestic violence and survivor. So 3.66 times more likely deaf women are to experience this in their lives, whether it's sexual violence or domestic violence, typically with a partner. And those statistics say that deaf and hard of hearing individuals in the United States have a higher um, rate of victimization of domestic violence and sexual violence. And that can be directly from um, loss or hearing loss or um, with the systemic barriers that people experience. And then you have to understand that people that don't experience deafness have that communication access. They're able to ask for help. They don't have those barriers that deaf people do. So that's a systemic barrier as well to hard of hearing and deaf people. And so that's why those rates are higher. Let's see, next slide. Okay. And now I do want to introduce, I don't know if you're familiar with the term of autism. It's AUDISM, not AUT. There is a difference between the D and the T. So autism, there's a deaf researcher, I believe it was there was a research in 1971 in, I'm going to catch that spelling again, spelling. The name was Tom Humphreys, who did the research on that, talking about people who have experienced depression, deaf who've experienced depression, and that was back in 1971 when this was published, and the term was brought out that was autism. And it's different than other disabled people. It's a different experience, that type of oppression. So there's some definitions that I want to give you. It's an attitude based on pathology, ideations, those negative stigmas, people people who cannot hear. Also, it means that a person is judgmental and bases that on whether or not a person can hear and speak. If they cannot, then um, it's a negative stigma and a negative judgment on that person. A lot of assumptions that survivors have access to the same language, that everybody is hearing, assume everybody hears and has the same access to information, the same as hearing survivors. Next slide, please. So, different tactics that survivors use and experience with their trauma, with the person of harm, the person that causes harm. You have to be aware of autism and using autism against the survivor. Sometimes it happens in relation to person, whether that harm is being committed through autism and that oppression. Sometimes that person causes harm, it's because of systemic barriers against the survivor. They use those barriers against the survivor. Reading this slide, the system, uh, sorry, the interpreter was checking this slide. Next slide, please. Sorry. Oh, sorry, no. I'm reading from the slide. So the system predisposed against people with marginalized identities. The person who is causing harm may tell the survivor, oh, listen, there's no services, they're not going to provide access. And in domestic violence relationships, the person who is causing harm may tell the survivor, oh, your English is really bad, you don't sign clear, and may be very critical of their language use, and really causing that kind of emotional harm as well. And if there are children involved, then they may not allow the children to use sign language at home. They deprive that of the survivor. Making decisions like financial decisions, um, may be dismissive of the deaf or hard of hearing person, saying that they can't make those decisions, maybe forcing them to sign paperwork, not explain what that paperwork is for, to say you have to sign this, and then depriving them of money, withholding freedom, withholding rights. Um, Another where autism kind of tends to show up is um, the deaf community is very close knit and very small, very close knit community, and use that community against the deaf person or against the survivor, spreading rumors, ruining that survivor's reputation, damaging that reputation. Because it's typically known, everybody knows each other in the deaf community. It may make them difficult for getting employment, withholding the children from them, spreading gossip and rumors. And because of the deaf community being so close knit, there's it's hard to have that privacy. So everybody knows information. It's hard to know who you can trust. And then the people that the survivor is closest to, their family and friends, often they know the person who is causing harm because they're friends. There's an overlap in that community because it's a very close-knit circle. And so there's a lot of overlap. So if they're going to leave that situation and not knowing who they can trust and where they can go, it's really difficult because they aren't sure who they can trust. So that causes even more isolation. And sometimes the survivor is facing a tough choice because they have to decide if they're going to stay in community, meaning, the person who is causing harm might find out, where they live, what they're doing, and find that information. So the survivor is often forced to make a very difficult choice to withdraw from the community and uproot themselves to another place where they don't necessarily know anyone. It's really difficult. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I'm going to finish this part about relationships, and then we'll talk about systemic barriers. So a deaf survivor, their stories, they report, typically their reports are difficult to do those reports, to report to authorities and explain what's going on, because of who their partners are. It's often not considered as serious when a deaf survivor accesses healthcare. Um, they have to tell those doctors, those nurses, what's going on for a variety of different reasons. And then their deaf identity, their deaf culture is not necessarily recognized. Their experience from a hearing medical perspective, often it's more pathological and pathologized. And the survivor, previous to going to the doctor, they may have never had an interpreter provided, never had that interpreter access, and that's not a great situation. And often the survivor has had previous trauma with receiving that medical care. And now the current trend for access is using video remote interpretation, VRI. We will cover that more a little bit later in another slide. We'll discuss that a little bit more. Next point on the list for barriers is shelter. Those barriers, for example, having to call and make those connections, setting up the intake questionnaire, answering all of those questions. Sometimes those questions are very lengthy and they have to go through an interpreter, and information may be skewed or misunderstood or may not be interpreted correctly. And the survivor may be traumatized from having to tell that story over and over and over again because they've moved around or had to be switched to different people. And sometimes those details are obscured, and um, there's conflict, internal conflicts. And so a lot of times their stories and their experience with violence, sometimes that information is lost or missing. We had many survivors try to call into shelters, and then the shelter screens them out saying, oh, it's not a good fit. This place isn't a good fit, and refer them out to somewhere else. We're going to switch interpreters one moment.
All right, it's Brian still here with a different voice again. So, okay. So court, as you can see on this list, they have lack of access. I would say from 50% to 75% of the time, courts have to be delayed because there's not an interpreter that would show up, or the access is not there, or having two deaf people in court against each other, where there's only one interpreter for both involved in court, causes a lot of interesting dilemmas. And so then it's put on hold and it's delayed and then it's delayed again. And so there's a lot that's involved in that. And we're not, it's a difficult thing for court to get those. And it's also hard because you have to get court certified interpreters throughout the state. I think there's only 37 certified court interpreters in the state of California right now. Only 37 that are actually able to sign and court certified. We just don't have enough interpreters. So that's a difficulty. That creates an impact on the survivor and their situation. They are less likely to get that protection that they need, and less likely to have the due process, less likely to not able to have direct communication. And so that everything happens through an interpreter and then through interpretation, and the words can get, misunderstood or changed or construed. So Araceli has actually just put something in the chat that says the courthouse will fly in certified deaf interpreters. I will explain what certified deaf interpreters are later. San Jose has, the courthouse has to fly people in at times as deaf interpreters in the state of California, just because, again, we don't have enough. In Northern California, there's not enough certified interpreters to provide services. And then next on the list, we've got, in addition to court, there's also police, law enforcement. There's, a lot of barriers there. It's rare for the police when they are involved, they rarely provide full access. And so we have had situations where police are they said, send a signer that they maybe took 1 or 2 sign language classes, and they place them in thinking that that's equal to providing a professional interpreter, and that causes a lot of harm and a lot of trouble. When police fill out the reports and the statements, I've often seen these reports, and there's a lot of mistakes, a lot of errors that are made, and that impacts the survivors as well. Their ability to qualify for assistance, a lot of different things. In addition to the police, we also have the dealings with Department of Children and Family Services, DCFS, where I've noticed there's a strong bias against the deaf survivors. Often they think, oh, you're deaf. Oh, you're a single mom. You're very weak, vulnerable. You can't parent. And even though, they even question how they're raising children, and they take that access away and that right away. And deaf moms, especially of deaf moms of color, or if they have mental health or different issues, the threat of taking the children away even doubles and triples. And so there's a reason, the whole reason there behind that is autism, the attitude of maybe sometimes it's the implicit bias that's there because they're not recognizing it themselves as DCFS employees. In addition to that, the attitude of those that are involved, they place fault. They've failed to protect their children, and so there's a lot of blame and fault put on the survivors. Social workers have kind of that attitude of, oh, you're failing to protect those children because you're deaf. How are you a good parent when you can't hear? That's kind of the attitude that is seen within these survivor stories. Oftentimes, the court orders for survivors will say, oh, go take classes, go take these specific services, and the court doesn't even think about access. For example, survivors sometimes are ordered to go take a domestic violence class. And if that happens, where the survivor is in their little area that they live, at the same time, there's the Deaf Hope provides those classes here, but if their survivor is maybe in Mississippi, Alabama, in those other states, Oklahoma, other areas where there's no deaf services like we have here with Deaf Hope, they are forced to take classes with a hearing program where who pays for the interpreter, who gives the access for those sign language interpreters with those survivors. And so they're forced to take classes, parenting classes, where there's no interpreter, and they just sit there and they're not understanding a word that's being said because there's no interpreter provided. And they just check it off and say, okay, we did it, we were there. So where's the benefit there? Where's that benefit of actually learning something? Where's that, equal access where we have to follow court orders and we have to fight for access, and we have to also understand that here at Deaf Hope, we do provide those classes, and we are lucky that we have those that we can provide. And again, we are facing the attitudes of, oh, deaf, oh, it's not believable. Where's the proof? Show us what's really happening. Okay, next slide, please. So here we have, I'm not going to go into deep on this, but Deaf Hope has a design, an illustration here that you can see called Deaf Power and Control. As you can see here, the illustration provides a great visual. There's some English wording, but it's very minimal in terms of the English wording. We did not invent this. It actually came from Duluth. They actually set this up for hearing and able-bodied women and survivors, but then we took it and adapted it to fit with our culture and the deaf people that we work with. So this shows different identities of deaf, deafblind, Asian deaf, Latinx, immigrant deaf, that kind of thing. Deaf people who use wheelchairs, similar same-sex couples, that kind of thing. That variety of identity that we deal with, that all of us actually are impacted by. But this shows a wheel of it's not a complete wheel of everybody involved, it's not showing everything, but it's just kind of an example of maybe how deaf people with different identities maybe experience their different experiences within domestic violence and not being a survivor. Maybe as a first-time survivor, they're like not sure what exactly to do. We can give them this, and we can explain what this will entails, and just to help them understand that domestic violence is not only physical. It's not physical abuse only. It can be financial. It can be involve children. It can be, an isolation situation where you've cut off from society, and friends and family have happened. And so those that are survivors can recognize, oh yes, I did experience some sort of domestic violence. Next slide, please. Just briefly want to mention this language justice slide. Language justice is a systematic fair treatment of people for all languages, communities, and respect for everybody's fundamental language rights. Next slide, please. And this is a perfect example here of how we practice language justice. You're maybe familiar with the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. That is the goal of language access, to create legal requirements, minimum legal requirements for entities, businesses, academia, government agencies, whatever, to provide access for language. And the language access is not the only thing, but we do recognize where the bare minimum access lies, and that can cause harm, where there's just not enough provided. For example, language access could look like, for example, for a deaf survivor, maybe looks like hiring an ASL interpreter. And the ASL interpreter is a professional interpreter. There's a deaf survivor, and they are put together. However, when you add that language justice, the deaf survivor maybe is Black, maybe is a Black deaf person, and they use Black sign language, meaning the interpreter that is there should match what their needs are to provide the best access possible. That is one just example of language access and language justice. So bare minimum is the legal requirement, but it's not always the best. Yeah, perfect. Okay, next slide. Okay, and now we will, obviously, you can't talk about our work without talking about disability justice. So disability justice and language justice overlap. Disability justice is the recognition that ableism intersects with all forms of oppression, and the affirmation that disability communities hold vital insights to dismantle systemic injustice by promoting accessibility, inclusion, and equity for all people. Next slide, please. So here at Deaf Hope, we use this disability justice framework, understanding that we recognize all bodies are unique, essential. All bodies have strengths, all have needs that must be met. We are powerful, even though there might be complexities of our bodies, but because of them, we are powerful. Our bodies are confined by ability and race and gender, sexuality, class, nation state, religion, and so much more, but we cannot separate them. Next slide. So I think this should be my last slide, and then I'll turn it over to Arcelia. But the goal again is at Deaf Hope, we use our services here to provide access. Irana briefly mentioned some of the services that we do provide. We do provide classes, we provide domestic violence education, we provide parenting classes, classes in American Sign Language, direct communication with those survivors to actually learn the best that they can. We also provide peer counseling. We provide virtual support groups. We do court accompaniment as well, if needed, in court and hospital, meetings with the police, law enforcement, Department of Justice and Family Services. We provide translation if if someone gets something in the mail and they're just not understanding anything that is said on the form, we can provide help with that in ASL. We also help to fill out applications for different things related to their experiences and, applying for victim financial help, protective orders, that kind of thing with courts. And so I just want to talk about our framework of services here. We have identified 4 key aspects. We name it CAST, CAST. C meaning culturally responsive, A accessible, S survivor-centered, and T trauma-informed. Altogether, those 4 work together to create our framework for services here at Deaf Hope. I think now's a good time. I'm going to turn it over to Arcelia.
Okay, great. So I want to explain a little bit about myself. I've been doing direct services online for 10 years now. And there's such a wide variety of survivors, different backgrounds, survivors who have education, um, all the way to people that have unique sign language needs within the deaf community, different grassroots communities, people that have experienced language deprivation. Maybe they're in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and just learning to sign 5 or 6 years ago. There's a broad range. And I would like to mention access to interpreters. So they think, oh, found an interpreter, check, that's taken care of, but it may not be a good fit. Just because you've placed an interpreter, just a general interpreter, sometimes there's other needs. They might need me to help facilitate that because I have information about their background, their signing needs. I may have been working with them for years with their language. So just to get to the point, through the years, I have learned with cultural compatibility within the deaf community, cultural accommodations, being able to make those changes to match their needs and make those adjustments. It's quite the learning curve, and I didn't do that my entire career, but one thing that I have noticed that is very beneficial to survivors is giving them less structure to where they can express themselves and express their needs for help. Just being able to express themselves and get that information out. They want to be heard. And traditionally, asking those questions, it's asking the questions for intakes, maybe for doctor's appointments, that whole process going through there. There's background information that's necessary, building that trust in a natural way. So we don't want to just have that conversation in isolation and have nothing to do with the intake forms. We have that conversation. So sometimes within the deaf community, because it is very small, the deaf community, we have somebody looking at us and maybe they have that documentation and they want to have more information on that. They might take it to a friend. They don't want to take it to a friend. So sometimes it's nice to have a third party. I don't ever push for that information. So if they want to tell me something, if they want to ask for help, if they need assistance with documentation, CPS, I do know that we can find the answer later on if I don't necessarily feel that's we have to ask that question in the moment. So as we go and we have a conversation, I find information. So that's how I do screenings and intakes. Um, a lot of times, stories will come up and comments are made, and their experience are expressed throughout that conversation. So I do allow it without structure to have that conversation. I feel that that's more supportive. So when we're having that conversation during an intake assessment, we do have, I ask them if they have a support system. If they don't, then I keep that in the back of my mind. So I can ask them not necessarily about their family situation or their friends or what that support looks like, and navigating through that, then I can screen out questions and get those answers that are needed for the intake. Because the community is quite small, it's not necessarily relying on just one person for support for everything. And I have noticed quite often that does happen where I have a support person, but then they realize, um, they bring that information to one person and then that person is overwhelmed because they put so much onto them. So we try to do a safety plan with survivors by using our pod mapping, and to help them build their support system by identifying which of those individuals that they can go to for different things, and then asking permission. I speak to those people and I have a transparent discussion what I can and cannot do, just so that everybody's on the same page and aware. And that way, those supports can be delegated to different people within their support system. And then our advocacy style, we don't expect survivors to come to us because a lot of our survivors are very limited with transportation. They don't have any, or they're on government benefits and their money is very tight. So we don't ask them to come here, and maybe it's not safe for them. So we do go to them, and we do mobile advocacy. And so that way we can help survivors where they feel safe. We can meet them there. We also have some kinds of aids. It's very limited on our co-advocacy. We have a larger agency that we do have more resources through. So the mutual aid is very helpful when we are able to go side by side with them. We also provide support groups through Zoom 2 times a week. Those are different hours, those different meetings. That way they can fit within if they have a job or if they're not employed. That way our survivors, if they're local or out of state, they have access because a lot of them, well, across the United States, there's 75% that do not have domestic violence services available to them locally. So they don't have that general advocacy agency that they can go to, like what we have here in this area. We do have DCARA, and we work together. We partner with them for general advocacy, and then we work specifically with domestic violence. And then we have those wraparound services to help with ASL. I see a questions popping up, and I saw that question about pod mapping. We'll get to that in another slide. And we also have survivors. We have services in ASL. We have a class. We have a large request for ASL classes. so we did get certified to provide that ASL parenting class. So our curriculum is from the Department of Human Services. So if you have a survivor that does want to learn, or if it's court ordered, or if it's ordered by CPS, we are happy to provide that support in ASL parenting classes. Next slide. Okay. To answer that question that came up in the chat, pod mapping. This was created by the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, BTAG, BTJT. So you'll see in the center of the circle, there's the large circle, that the smaller circle within the big circle is the survivor. And then the other circles are, well, it depends on the survivor, their support system with a variety of different people, or it could be places and areas and sensitive areas that they are able to go to, that they feel connected to, um, different resources that they feel that they can take advantage of for themselves, that they are able to connect with. That's their support system. And a lot of survivors will put down information, and they just put down one or two, and they leave the rest blank, but we help them build their people, build their connections, and encourage them to join support groups, um, go to deaf events. A lot of people don't have access to technology, so we provide them lots of different resources in the area. They look for more support and we're always looking for more support areas within the Bay Area. Next slide. Okay, so now talking about interpreters. Often, some agencies will say, oh, yeah, we can connect you with an interpreting agency. And they think, oh, I've done my part. I've created that access. Yes, that's great. At the same time, we want to make sure that the interpreting agency um, is connected to the deaf community and used by the deaf community. There's a lot of agencies that have bad reputations um, within the deaf community and deaf members, or they partner with an agency that's more of a language bank, meaning they have a broad spectrum of a variety of different interpreters. They have ASL, of course, yes, but typically a language bank interpreting agency, their screening process um, for deaf and ASL users is the bare minimum. They might have somebody that just barely knows ASL, maybe they're a level 3, they have not yet taken a certification, they have not gone into any in-depth training, they don't have that information. So sometimes we do see that an agency placing those interpreters in police interviews, and there's a huge communication breakdown, and that's a loss for the deaf survivors. That's a very negative experience, and so we want to make sure that we put that information out there for agencies, that they need to have interpreters for police interviews that are qualified, for domestic violence or sexual violence that are trauma-informed interpreters. Most specifically, they need to be able to be labeled that and then place those interpreters into those situations, because some agencies, the requester doesn't communicate exactly what the interpreter is going to show up and experience. Maybe they had no information that it was a police interview or a domestic violence situation, and the interpreter isn't comfortable in that situation. They know they're not a good fit, and so they're not able to stay, and that does cause a lot of harm. So we do ask that you be mindful of who you're contracting with. And if you're not sure, always you can ask us and we can give you a list of interpreters who are familiar with our work and what we do. Yeah, always you can reach out to us because we want to help you find the correct interpreters. And we want to make sure that you have certified hearing interpreters as well. So the message that we give the message that we have, like if it's a police interview, if it's a hospital situation, um, and people say, oh, well, that, it's, we need a cheaper interpreter. So a lot of those that have lower rates are less experienced. And those interpreters that do have a lot of experience do have higher rates. So just be mindful of that. We're going to switch interpreters one moment.
Yeah, so yeah, the cost of access is really valid, very important. Again, I have seen where survivors will say, oh, we got an interpreter, but then they get there and they don't understand it. It's not the right fit. So I have often encouraged those organizations to allow deaf advocacy within the meetings, to be able to actually look and get the information so that we can explain to the survivor afterwards and give that support and that extra information, maybe 2, 3, 4 times more, so that it actually makes sense to the survivor. Because I have experienced where agencies will say, oh yeah, we got this, we don't need you to be part of our meetings, which is okay, fine. But then as a result, they don't oftentimes understand, because it's one meeting that's very short and it doesn't really encompass everything that needs to be said. So then we are called upon to actually come in and help and advocate. So it's important for us to have the advocacy there to make the process a little more smooth. Next slide, please. I always have, a list of, checking in with survivors. For example, it's nice to actually say, who is your preferred interpreter to that survivor? Sometimes survivors have that trauma with another interpreter, and it's very sensitive. And so they will need to be comfortable and work with those interpreters. So I will ask. Sometimes the preferred interpreter comes to the setting, but then sometimes they don't have that trauma-informed background. They don't have that. And so we have to discuss that with the survivor, saying sometimes that interpreter doesn't have the information needed, or we don't have the ability to get a hold of that interpreter. So, and then sometimes those deaf survivors are actually language deprived. And so that's when we call upon a certified deaf interpreter to come into the situation to help provide access and that support of need. So it's important that we find the support that we need to provide that access to those survivors. I also encourage at least 2 weeks to 3 weeks in advance notice, because most of the interpreters that I've experienced working with in the area are very booked. They have appointments back to back. And so interpreters that have less experience obviously would have more availability. And that's not the best case scenario. So yeah, making sure that you book in advance to keep it transparent, to make sure that, the assignment, the interpreters know what the assignment is or what's it for, any background information that you can give. We encourage having 2 interpreters as a team. We have 2 interpreters to prevent fatigue. We have, like you can see today, we have 2 interpreters that are switching back and forth every 15 to 30 minutes. And for the it's actually provides the best experience for the deaf client and deaf survivor, because interpreters become very fatigued with a lot of information coming through. And the standard to get 2 interpreters, like, it needs to be canceled. If you do have to cancel, it needs to be canceled 48 hours or more in advance. If you cancel last minute within that 48 hours, it is still charged. Sometimes that happens. So most of the time, interpreters will book a 2-hour minimum for those types of for different types of appointments. Sometimes even I've seen where the new interpreters will, talk, or clients will actually hire an interpreter, but then the client will talk to the interpreter instead of talking to the deaf individual. And I'm like, wait a minute, I'm here. I'm the person you need to talk to. So when you have an interpreter that comes into an assignment or into a setting, you just need to kind of pretend like the interpreter's invisible. Talk to the deaf client, talk to the deaf survivor. And sometimes the survivor will even look at you as the hearing person, and some survivors might look at the interpreter and kind of go, not sure, making sure that there's the, the signs provided are appropriate and matching the setting and style. When we do that, the message is sometimes the message needs to be that I'm central to you. I'm there for you. And remember that word we talked about, autism. Well, keeping that, person-centered approach is pretty vital. Next slide, please. So deaf people actually use an app or a platform that we have hardwired. Maybe you've seen them in the FMC building, or I believe in different buildings here that will have a video relay or video phone room that we can make calls. That is called a VRS, Video Relay Services. That is funded by the Federal Communications Commission, FCC. And that's funded to provide services, which is free for us as deaf individuals to make phone calls. And we have complete access. I do want to mention that FCC is very strict about showing documentation. So if we have a setting where it's a state ID, we must show in advance. And so some of the undocumented survivors, immigrants, don't have an ID, and they aren't provided VRS services. And so we have to kind of get creative and get, a friend's account or whatnot to make phone calls. So there is one barrier that we've seen recently with VRS. VRS, some survivors try to be creative because we cannot use VRS services in the same room as another. So sometimes survivors, like a police, will come into their home, they need an interpreter. Sometimes we will have to tell them police need to go to another room so that I can call and we can have a conversation that way. Because if the interpreter sees that the survivor is in the same room as the police or law enforcement, the interpreter is asked to hang up the phone. Like Brian mentioned, yes, in the chat, that's correct. B, you have to submit your social security number. That is a barrier for some deaf, because some deaf survivors are undocumented, like I mentioned. So within VRS, now we are going to talk about VRI, which is video remote interpreting. That is a paid contract service. It is nothing related to the FCC, nothing at all. It is more of interpreting services that is one-on-one. For example, when I go to my doctor's appointment, sometimes I need to see the doctor like tomorrow, and to find an interpreter in person on site is hard. And so they will use VRI, video remote interpreting. So I will go to the doctor, and there's a screen there that I will, use. And there's very much pros and cons to that setting, but sometimes the internet doesn't work. It's not strong enough. I have experienced where I've had an appointment within a legal organization that they use VRI, and we've lost 20 minutes in the appointment because of the internet connection and difficulties there. So it becomes very frustrating. And, when there's not an interpreter and there's a lot of time delay. So just make sure that you have a good, strong connection. I have experienced where I'm in a surgery room for the hospital and they're struggling with connection, and the nurse is trying to figure it out. You have to call IT and get them there. It becomes so complicated. So again, I encourage not to use VRI for high risk meetings and settings, meetings with lawyers, meetings with the police, interviews, that kind of thing. VRI and video remote interpreting, you can definitely miss a lot. And there's a lot of facial nuances and body languages that you can miss within video remote interpreting. So when there is a high risk meeting involved, highly encourage to using a warm body on-site interpreter. VRS, yes, like Suzanne mentioned, it is federally funded. VRI typically is paid by who the provider is, meaning, for example, COCO will cover the fees, or the hospital has a contract with an agency that provides VRI services, so the hospital pays for that. Hopefully that clarifies things. Okay, and let's see, next slide. I am curious how many of you have worked with a deaf interpreter before or have seen a deaf interpreter before in action. No, nobody? Seems like nobody has. No? Okay. Great. One, yeah. Couple, Leslie, great. Perfect. So CDI is abbreviation. Oh, perfect. Yes. So there's two. There's CDI, which is Certified Deaf Interpreter. Those are certified under the RID agency, Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf. They take a special test to become certified in court or medical or different settings. Also, we have another called DI, which is Deaf Interpreter. Those are more of community interpreters, community context interpreters. They're certified to work in like legal interviews, depending on the situation. And there is a lot of confusion with the certification process currently. And there's a lot of deaf interpreters that are not able to get certified at the moment, but we have seen where there's a professional certified interpreter, CDI, will be partnered with a DI, deaf interpreter, to observe, and that's we have to kind of get creative in certain situations, but there are both. In certain specific situations, it's best practice to get a certified deaf interpreter, a CDI. Most hearing interpreters have learned, sign language. It's not their native language. And deaf people, as native signers and native ASL users, sometimes are able to kind of match the style of the interpreter, more English, more ASL based, more, depending on the language deprivation of the person, grassroots type situations. There are different ranges of signing and how we deliver the information. With an interpreter that's not able to maybe capture the full nuances that sometimes a deaf interpreter will. So, for example, I have a story for you where we had a deaf man who was in trouble for a crime, came to court, and they did not have a CDI at the time, not certified interpreter, just had a regular hearing interpreter there. It was a good 2 years worth of trial and court proceedings. The judge says to the deaf person named George, "Hey, George, so are you guilty?" And George says, "Yeah, I'm guilty. Yeah." And the interpreter kind of questioned, because in court, they'd been doing 2 years worth of these proceedings. And so answered yes. And yes, thank you for letting me know. But then as it went on to sentencing, he had to do time in jail and prison. And the deaf advocate was connecting to George while they were in prison and says, "Hey, we were reading through his case as the deaf advocate and noticed, well, wait a minute, why did you admit guilt? Why did you admit guilt on that case?" And George says, "No, I never admitted guilt. No, I never did. I was fighting in court. I fought. And in the court transcript, it says that George pled guilty." And he was like, "Oh my gosh," he looked back and thought back and said, "Oh my gosh, I thought that maybe the the judge was asking me what my name was. And my name sign happens to be the same sign as guilty, George on the heart with a G. And so that situation is where a CDI would have probably caught that and went, oh, your name is George. That's correct. But then was it the CDI would have expanded upon that saying, you know, the difference between George, the name sign, and guilty. And so that was pretty impactful. And to sign this first. Okay, so for a different situation, if I were to say I'm wiped, I'm wiped out, people would sign I'm wiped like this, like laying on your back. I'm wiped out. Deaf folks would look at that and say, oh, I'm laying on my back. I'm laying down on my back. But some people, some deaf people who sign that as if they're on their stomach instead of on their back. And so there's some nuances that are important to recognize within sign language that certified deaf interpreters may recognize and a hearing interpreter might not catch. So to make that adjustment with a CDI is crucial in certain situations.
So a CDI does have a very distinct difference as being embedded into the culture, so they have that information. So I think it's a better way to provide that information. So a lot of times we'll use photos or pictures or draw things out. For example, Cal, the interpreter did not catch that finger spelling. CalWorks. Maybe they don't understand what that means. So we'll show a picture of the EBT card. Oh yeah, and then the deaf person will, yeah, I know what that is. Yeah. So a deaf interpreter would be able to tell the judge, I signed the question, but I'm not able to establish the concept of that. So they'll have that discussion with the judge to clarify. So that's one thing that you have to be very open and very transparent communication within the courtroom that I don't see have to happen very often. So with deaf blind, deaf disabled, there's a lot of deprivation with those folks. Happens a lot of the time. So a 1 hour meeting, it'll be very easy pulled into 3 hours or more. So it really stretches time. We're really able to stretch that time if needed. Maybe sometimes the appointment be very short, just be a 1 hour meeting. But when that 1 hour is over, then we only did a quarter or half of the information that we would normally want to be able to discuss. Okay, next slide. So this is a good picture of how the deaf interpreter and hearing interpreter would stand in the area. And where they stand is important because sometimes deaf people like to be able to see both and look between them. Sometimes, some deaf, it's just overwhelming to try and look between both interpreters. So with a hearing interpreter, typically they stand behind the deaf person. And then the deaf interpreter will be facing the other the deaf interpreter will be facing the deaf person. So that way, it's just a different way to arrange people. It depends on preferences, what the situation looks like, what's best accessible. Sometimes I work with a deaf survivor who has serious language deprivation. It has taken me 20 to 30 minutes just to try and figure out exact what that information is because the court has specific information that you have to follow and timelines, and you might not necessarily be able to take that time to tease that out and get that information. So sometimes maybe the deaf survivor will say, back when I was 14, something happened, and I might think that they were actually talking about it was February 14. So we really have to tease out what that information is by asking those questions, pulling out a calendar and look and saying, did you mean Valentine's Day? And maybe the deaf person will be like, no, 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 way back 14. And so I understand that, oh no, she's talking about when her daughter was 14, but the way that they signed it looked like 14 last week. So it looked like back last week on Friday. So really, they meant way back last year, or sometimes their signing is not clear. So often I'll have a team pair with another CDI so that we can really get that information so that we can submit that to the court. Next slide. Best practice for hearing providers. So depending on your communication structures, making sure that you have backup communication strategies, um, trying to figure out on the spot what you're going to do. Sometimes when you're trying to figure that out and discussing it with another advocate, the survivor feels overlooked. Are you talking about me? Are you gossiping about me? So there's a lot of misunderstandings that can happen when you're having that dialogue without full communication transparency. So a lot of times the survivors might feel off put. And really, it's just people trying to do their jobs and trying to do their work, but trying to make sure that that communication is provided so that it is deaf friendly, that communication is accessible. So accessibility tools. There's a wide variety. Some survivors are pretty flexible. Sometimes they'll want an interpreter be brought in. Always ask the survivor what their preference is. We like to do a warm referral, so we'll connect, like a lot of times they'll be connected to us as us being a survivor agency. And so maybe other agencies have never worked with a deaf survivor. So having that warm connection, sending an email to us and providing that information, that's very helpful. Having a safety plan, working, um, what that looks like. Next slide. I strongly encourage co-advocacy. That is the best, most effective way to support survivors. And I've seen a lot of them fall through the cracks. Often, when there's no co-advocacy approach, many of them do not have the skills to self-advocate because they don't understand the systems. A lot of the information they don't have. Maybe there's volunteers that can provide some extra information. That's always appreciated. A lot of times they'll be saying, "Oh, I didn't know that. I never had that information," or um, sharing that information with from systemic information. And I'll be honest, sometimes it's a back failure of information. There's just so very much. It really penalizes deaf survivors. So sitting down and coaching them through, explaining, sharing, having that dialogue. Same thing with the courtroom. Survivors a lot of times want to really expand on information. Judges just want the bullet points, the basic information, get to the point. So I will work with them to prepare them for court so that when they get there, they know. And doing that co-advocacy, I think it's just the best way, working together. I've had many experiences where the attorney and that attorney-client privilege, and I've been shut out of those meetings because of the attorney-client privilege, and the deaf survivor will come out and they only understand about half of it and they feel very overwhelmed and it feels like information dumping. So sometimes I really have to work with their stories and I have holes within those stories and I'm trying to figure out how things connect. And lawyers are like, oh no, it's just between me and the deaf survivor. But I really have to advocate for language accessibility and language equality and language justice. And it's very frustrating. And so then when I can come in, I can really encourage the attorney to prepare for that and allow deaf advocacy. And I explain that that's going to help the attorney, and I explain the information over and over again because I can interrupt and say, "Oh, I didn't get that. I didn't understand that," and get them to tell the story more than once so that I can get the full information. And sometimes that's the cost of privacy between the deaf survivor and the lawyer. I just really have to advocate to be a part of that meeting. That way, the deaf survivor feels better um, listened to and that they have all the information. Next slide. I do want to acknowledge we only have 5 minutes, so I do want to make sure that we have time for question and answer. So I think with our services for survivors, just filling out line items for the budget and for funding accessibility. A lot of times we'll see people say, "Sorry, we don't have the budget for that. Do you have volunteers?" And put the responsibility onto the survivor. And that's one thing that we can start working on. Video phones being established within your organizations, getting those set up, safety equipment in the shelters, fire alarms that have lights. A lot of them are not provided within shelters. Videos and movies with captioning. It's just the little things that survivors really notice and recognize that they're thinking about these things. Shelters and organizations are thinking about these details that deaf people seem to often feel like an afterthought. So establishing these things and having them set up makes deaf people feel seen if you can provide those things. Providing access for one-on-one and group meetings and the variety of different things that you provide. Um, a lot of times deaf people show up and then they don't understand what's going on during the meeting because there's no language accessibility. If you are curious about the list of things on my accessibility plan, feel free to ask me questions. We're happy to have that conversation and share those supports. Next slide. Allyship. It's really important to our work with survivors. Having court interpreters that have a good relationship with allyship that are willing to help me with that accessibility into court, helping those survivors. Um, and then even if they're in a cell, providing that language accessibility, that's where allyship really shows up. And it's a long process. So our next slide, we will share community resources, counseling services, advocacy services, interpreting agencies. There's the whole list there, just some general resources. Feel free to read through those, send any questions that you might have. We're happy to answer. And then how to contact us. We do have text, video phone, so feel free to refer through those contact resources. If you have any questions, you can text here. I do want to say thank you for coming, for learning how to improve services with deaf survivors. If there are any questions, if you're curious, you need any clarifications, happy to hear it, bring them on.
Samantha, are there any questions? We have 2 minutes left.
I haven't seen any posted.
Aracelia, thank you so much. One thing I want to share with our friends is that I used to represent deaf clients and in family court and worked with, like, I think at the time there were about 2 CDI interpreters in the Bay Area. Are there still enough CDIs?
No, no, they're not. There's a lot of hearing interpreters for court, but they're getting older. So there's no new, younger court interpreters coming in. And that's because the testing process was put on hold. So that's a large barrier for us as well. Also with CDIs, certified deaf interpreters, there are CDIs. that do ASL appropriately. They're skilled. They're very skilled in working with language deprivation situations. Especially there's a lot of like deaf Hispanic, Spanish speaking. So there's a lot of changes and negotiations that need to be done within language there. So not necessarily just bringing in a CDI, but again, if you're not sure, just reach out to us. I've worked with those CDIs. I'm happy to share information.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian, Araceli. I think that was really useful and informative training. I'm getting a lot of love over here in the chat box. So thank you all for coming. Have a great weekend, everyone, and hope to see you soon.
Goodbye. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.